3. Dear Governor Stevenson, Herzog wrote, gripping his seat in the hurtling train. Just a word with you, friend. I supported you in 1952. Like many others, I thought this country might be ready for its great age in the world and intelligence at last assert itself in public affairs. A little more of Emerson's American Scholar, the intellectuals coming into their own. But the instinct of the people was to reject mentality and its images, ideas, perhaps mistrusted them as foreign. It preferred to put its trust in visible goods. So things go on as before with those who think a great deal and effect nothing, and those who think nothing evidently doing it all. You might as well be working for them, I suppose. I am sure the Coriolanus bit was painful, kissing the asses of the voters, especially in the cold states like New Hampshire. Perhaps you did contribute something useful in the last decade, showing up the old-fashioned man grieving at the loss of his private life, sacrificed to public service. Bah! The general won because he expressed low-grade universal potato love. Well, Herzog, what do you want? An angel from the skies. This train would run him over. Dear Ramona, you mustn't think because I've taken a powder briefly that I don't care for you. I do. I feel you close about me much of the time, and last week, at the party when I saw you across the room in your hat with flowers, your hair crowded down close to your bright cheeks, I had a glimpse of what it might be like to love you. He exclaimed mentally, marry me, be my wife, end my troubles, and was staggered by his rashness, his weakness, and by the characteristic nature of such an outburst, for he saw how very neurotic and typical it was. We must be what we are. That is necessity. And what are we? Well, here he was trying to hold on to Ramona as he ran from her, and thinking that he was binding her, he bound himself, and the culmination of this clever goofiness might be to entrap himself. Self-development, self-realization, happiness, these were the titles under which these lunacies occurred. Ah, poor fellow! And Herzog momentarily joined the objective world in looking down on himself. He too could smile at Herzog and despise him. But there still remained the fact. I am Herzog. I have to be that man. There is no one else to do it. After smiling, he must return to his own self and see the thing through. But there was a brainstorm for you. The third Mrs. Herzog. This was what infantile fixations did to you, early traumata, which a man could not molt and leave empty on the bushes like a cicada. No true individual has existed yet, able to live, able to die. Only diseased, tragic, or dismal, and ludicrous fools who sometimes hope to achieve some ideal by fiat, by their great desire for it, but usually by bullying all mankind into believing them. From many points of view, Ramona truly was a desirable wife. She was understanding, educated, well situated in New York, money, and sexuality, a natural masterpiece. What breasts, lovely ample shoulders, the belly deep, legs brief and a little bowed, but for that very reason especially attractive. It was all there. Only he was not through with love and hate elsewhere. Herzog had unfinished business. Dear Zinka, I dreamed about you last week. In my dream we were talking a walk in Ljubljana, and I had to get my ticket for Trieste. I was sorry to leave, but it was better for you that I should. It was snowing. Actually, it did snow, not only in the dream, even when I got to Venice. This year I covered half the world and saw people in such numbers it seemed to me I saw everybody but the dead, whom perhaps I was looking for. Dear Mr. Nehru, I think I have the most important thing to tell you. Dear Mr. King, the Negroes of Alabama filled me with admiration. White America is in danger of being depoliticalized. Let us hope this example by Negroes will penetrate the hypnotic trance of the majority. The political question in modern democracies is one of the reality of public questions. Should all of these become matters of fantasy, the old political order is ended. I, for one, wish to go on record recognizing the moral dignity of your group, not the Powells, who want to be as corrupt as white demagogues, nor the Muslims building on hate. Dear Commissioner Wilson, I sat next to you at the narcotics conference last year. Herzog, a stocky fellow, dark eyes, scar on his neck, grizzled, in an Ivy League suit, selected by his wife, a bad cut, far too youthful for my figure. I wonder if you will allow me to make a few observations on your police force. It's not the fault of any single person that civil order can't be maintained in a community. But I am concerned. I have a small daughter who lives near Jackson Park, and you know as well as I do the parks are not properly policed. Gangs of hoodlums make it worth your life to go in. Dear Mr. Alderman, must the Army have its Nike missile site on the point? Perfectly futile, I believe, obsolete and taking up space. Plenty of other sites in the city. Why not move this useless junk to some blighted area? Quickly, quickly, more! The train rushed over the landscape. It swooped past New Haven. It ran with all its might toward Rhode Island. Herzog, now barely looking through the tinted, immovable, sealed window, felt his eager, flying spirit streaming out, speaking, piercing, making clear judgments, uttering final explanations, necessary words only. He was in a whirling ecstasy. He felt at the same time that his judgments exposed the boundless, baseless bossiness and willfulness, the nagging embedded in his mental constitution. Dear Moses E. Herzog, since when have you taken such an interest in social questions in the external world? Until lately, you led a life of innocent sloth. But suddenly, a Faustian spirit of discontent and universal reform descends on you. Scolding, invective. Dear Sirs, the Information Service was kind enough to send a package from Belgrade containing articles of winter wear. I did not want to take my long johns to Italy, the paradise of exiles, and regretted it. It was snowing when I got to Venice. I couldn't get into the Vaporetto with my valise. Dear Mr. Udall, a petroleum engineer I met recently in a Northwest jet told me our domestic oil reserves were almost used up, and that plans had been completed for blasting the polar caps with hydrogen bombs to get at the oil beneath. What about that? Shapiro! Herzog had a lot to explain to Shapiro, and he was certainly waiting for his explanations. Shapiro was not good-humored, although his face wore a good-humored look. His nose was sharp and angry, and his lips appeared to be smiling away their anger. His cheeks were white and plump, and his thin hair was combed straight back, glistening in the Rudolph Valentino or Ricardo Cortez style of the 20s. He had a dumpy figure, but wore natty clothes. Still, Shapiro was in the right this time. Shapiro, I should have written sooner to tell you, to apologize, to make amends. But I have a splendid excuse: trouble, sickness, disorder, afflictions. You've written a fine monograph. I hope I made that clear in my review. My memory abandoned me complete in one place, and I was all wrong about Joachim de Flores. You and Joachim must both forgive me. I was in a terrible state. Having agreed to review Shapiro's study before the trouble broke, Herzog couldn't get it out of it. He dragged the heavy volume with him all over Europe in his valise. It caused much pain in his side. He feared a hernia from it, and also ran up considerable overweight charges. Herzog kept reading away at it for the sake of the discipline, and under a growing burden of guilt. A bed in Belgrade, at the Metropole, with bottles of cherry juice, the trolley cars whizzing past in the frozen night. Finally, in Venice, I sat down and wrote my review. My excuse for the botch I made now follows. I assume since he's at Madison, Wisconsin, you've heard that I blew up in Chicago last October. We left the house in Louisville some time ago. Madeline wanted to finish her degree in Slavonic languages. She had about 10 courses in linguistics to take, and she got interested also in Sanskrit. Perhaps you can guess how she would work at things, her interest, passions. Do you remember that when you came to see us in the country 2 years ago, we discussed Chicago? Whether it would be safe to live in that slum. Shapiro, in his stylish pinstriped suit, pointed shoes, as if dressed for dinner, sat on Herzog's lawn. He was the profile of a thin man. His nose is sharp, but his throat sags and his cheeks hang a little towards the lips. Shapiro is very courtly, and he was impressed with Madeline. He thought her so beautiful, so intelligent. Well, she is. The conversation was spirited. Shapiro had come to see Moses ostensibly to get advice, actually to ask a favor, but he was enjoying Madeline's company. She excited him, and he was laughing as he drank his quinine water. The day was hot, but he didn't loosen his conservative necktie. His sharp black shoes glistened, and he has fat feet with bulging insteps. On the grass, mowed by himself, Moses sat in torn wash pants. Stirred by Madeline, Shapiro was particularly lively, almost shrieking when he laughed, and his laughter becoming more frequent, wilder, uncaused. His manner at the same time grew more formal, measured, judicious. He spoke in long sentences, Proustian, he may have thought, actually dramatic, and filled with incredible bombast. On balance, I should not venture to essay the merit of the tendency without more mature consideration, he was saying. Poor Shapiro! What a brute he was! That snarling wild laugh of his, and the white froth forming on his lips as he attacked everyone. Madeline was greatly stirred by him too, and on her high manners. They found each other exceedingly stimulating. She came from the house with the bottles and glasses on the tray, cheese, liver paste, crackers, ice, herring. She had on blue trousers and a yellow Chinese blouse. The coolie hat I bought her on Fifth Avenue. She said she was subject to sunstroke. Stepping quickly, she advanced from the shadow of the house into the sparkling grass, the cat leaping from her path, the bottles and glasses clinking. She hastened because she didn't want to miss any of the conversation. As she bent to set things out on the lawn table, Shapiro couldn't keep his eyes from the shape of her behind in that tight cotton knit fabric. Madeline, stuck away in the woods, was avid for scholarly conversation. Shapiro knew the literature of every field. He read all the publications. He had accounts with book dealers all over the world. When he found that Madeline was not only a beauty, but was preparing for her doctoral examination in Slavonic languages, he said, "How delightful!" And it was he himself who knew, betraying the knowledge by affection, that for a Russian Jew from Chicago's West Side, that "how delightful" was inappropriate. A German Jew from Kenwood might have gotten away with it. Old money in the dry goods business since 1880. But Shapiro's father had had no money and peddled rotten apples from Southwater Street in a wagon. There was more of the truth of life in those spotted, spoiled apples, and in old Shapiro, who smelled of the horse and of produce, than in all of these learned references. Madeline and the dignified visitor were talking about the Russian church. Tikhon Zadonsky, Dostoevsky, and Herzen Shapiro made a great production of learned references, correctly pronouncing all foreign words, whether in French, German, Serbian, Italian, Hungarian, Turkish, or Danish, snapping them out and laughing that heart-eating, suckling, snarling, undirected laugh, teeth moist, head worked back onto his shoulders. Ha! The thorns crackled. Liking the crackling of the thorns under a pot is the laughter of fools. The cicadas in great numbers were singing. That year they came out of the ground. Under such stimulation, Mattie's face did strange things. The tip of her nose moved, and her brows, which needed no help for cosmetics, rose with nervous eagerness, repeatedly, as if she were trying to clear her eyesight. Dr. Edvig said this was a diagnostic trait of paranoia. Between the huge trees surrounded by the Berkshire slopes, and not another house in sight to spoil the view, the grass was fresh and dense, the slender fine grass of June. The red-eyed cicadas, squat forms vividly colored where wet after molting, sopping, immobile, but drying, they crept, hopped, tumbled, flew, and in the high trees kept up a continuous chain of song. Shrilling. Culture, ideas, had taken the place of the church in Mattie's heart. A strange organ that must be. Herzog sat, thinking his own thoughts on the grass of Ludiville. His wash pants torn, feet bare, but his face that of an educated Jewish gentleman with fine lips, dark eyes. He watched his wife, on whom he doted, with a troubled, angry heart, another oddity among hearts, as she revealed the wealth of her mind to Shapiro. "My Russian is not what it could be," said Shapiro. "But how much you know about my subject," Madeline said. She was very happy. The blood glowed in her face, and her blue eyes were warm and brilliant. They opened a new subject, the Revolution of 1848. Shapiro had sweated through his starch collar. Only a dollar-crazed Croatian steelworker would have bought such a striped shirt. And what were his views of Bakunin, Kropotkin? Did he know Comfort's work? He did. Did he know Poggielli? Yes. He didn't feel that Poggielli had done full justice to certain important figures. Rozanoff, for instance. Though Rozanoff was cracked on certain questions, like the Jewish ritual bath, still he was a great figure, and his erotic mysticism was highly original. Highly. Leave it to those Russians. What hadn't they done for Western civilization? All the while repudiating the West and ridiculing it. Madeline, Herzog thought, became almost dangerously excited. He would tell, when her voice grew reedy, when her throat sounded positively like a clarinet, that she was bursting with ideas and feelings. And if Moses did not join in, if he sat there, in her own words, like a clunk bored resentful, he proved he didn't respect her intelligence. Now, Gersbach always boomed along in conversation. He was so emphatic in style, so impressive in his glances, looked so clever that you forgot to inquire whether he was making sense. The lawn was on an elevation with a view of fields and woods. Formed like a large teardrop of green, it had a gray elm at its small point, and the bark of the huge tree, dying of Dutch blight, was purplish gray. Scant leaves for such a vast growth. An oriole's nest, in the shape of a gray heart, hung from the twigs. God's veil over things makes them all riddles. If they were not all so particular, detailed, and very rich, I might have more rest from them. But I am a prisoner of perception, a compulsory witness. They are too exciting. Meantime, I dwell in yon house of dull boards. Herzog was worried about that elm. Must he cut it down? He hated to do it. Meanwhile, the cicadas all vibrated a coil in their bellies, a horny posterior band in a special chamber. Those billions of red eyes from the enclosing woods looked out, stared down, and the steep waves of sound drowned the summer afternoon. Herzog had seldom heard anything so beautiful as this massed continual harshness. Shapiro mentioned Soloviev, the younger one. Did he really have a vision in the British Museum, of all places? It so happened that Madeline had made a study of the younger Soloviev, and this was her opportunity. She had enough confidence now in Shapiro to speak freely. It would be appreciated genuinely. She gave a brief lecture on the career and thought of the dead Russian. Her offended look passed over Moses. She complained that he never really listened to her. He wanted to shine all the time, but that wasn't it. He had heard her lecture on the subject many times and far into the night. He didn't dare say he was sleepy. Anyway, it had to be quid pro quo, given these conditions, buried in the remote Berkshires, for he had to discuss knotty points of Rousseau and Hegel with her. He relied completely on her intellectual judgments. Before Soloviev, she had talked of no one but Joseph de Maistre, And before de Maistre, Herzog made up the list: the French Revolution, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Schliemann excavations at Troy, ex- extrasensory perception, then tarot cards, then Christian Science. Before that, Mirabeau, or was it mystery novels, Josephine Tay, or science fiction, Isaac Asimov? The intensity was always high. If she had one constant interest, it was murder mysteries. 3 or 4 a day she'd read. Black and hot under the green, the soil gave off its dampness. Herzog felt it in his bare feet. From Soloviev, madly, naturally turned to Berdiaev. And while speaking of slavery and freedom, the concept of sobornost, she opened the jar of pickled herring. Saliva spurted to Shapiro's lips. Quickly he pressed his folded handkerchief to the corners of his mouth. Herzog remembered him as a greedy eater. In the cubicle they had shared at school, he used to chew his pumpernickel and onion sandwiches with an open mouth. Now, at the smell of spice and vinegar, Shapiro's eyes flooded, though he managed to keep his portly, good-humored, sharp-nosed, refined look as he pressed the handkerchief to his shaven jowls. His plump, hairless hand, his quivering fingers. "No, no," he said. "Thank you very much, Mrs. Herzog, delightful. But I have a stomach condition." Condition he had ulcers. Vanity kept him from saying it. The psychosomatic implications were unflattering. Later that afternoon, he vomited in the wash basin. He must have eaten squid, thought Herzog, who had to do the cleaning up. Why didn't he use the toilet bowl? Too stout to bend? But that was in the aftermath of his visit. Before that, Moses recalled, there was a visit from the Gersbachs, Valentine and Phoebe. They stopped their little car under the catalpa tree, then in flower, though last year's pods still hung from the twigs. Out came Valentine in his swaying stride, and Phoebe, pale at every season of the year, calling after him in her complaining voice, "Val, Val!" She was returning a casserole she had broiled, one of Madeline's great iron pots, red as lobster shell. Descoware, made in Belgium. These visits often gave Herzog a depressed feeling he couldn't account for. Madeline sent him for more folding chairs. Perhaps it was the rotted honey fragrance of the white catalpa bells that got him. Faintly lined with pink within, heavy with pollen dust, they dropped on the gravel. Too beautiful. Little Ephraim Gersbach was making a pile of bells. Moses was glad to go for the chairs, into the musty disorder of the house, down to the stony, deaf security of the cellar. He took his time about the chairs. When he returned, they were speaking of Chicago. Gersbach standing with his hands in his hip pockets, his face just shaved, and his plume-like hair revealing heavy copper depths, was saying that his advice was to get the hell out of this backwater. Nothing interesting had happened here since the Battle of Saratoga. Over the hills, for Christ's sake. Phoebe, looking tired and pale, smoked her cigarette, faintly smiling, and hoping probably to be let alone. Among a sort of learned or eloquent people, she seemed to feel her dowdiness and insufficiency. Actually, she was far from stupid. She had fine eyes a bosom, good legs. If only she didn't make herself look like the head nurse, letting her dimples lengthen into disciplinary creases. Chicago, by all means, said Shapiro. That's the school for graduate studies. A little woman like Mrs. Herzog is just what the old place needs, too. Fill your big mouth with herring, Shapiro, Herzog thought, and mind your own fucking business. Madeline gave her husband a rapid, sidelong look. She was flattered, happy. She wanted him to be reminded, if he had forgotten, how high a value other people set upon her. Anyway, Shapiro, I was in no mood for Joachim de Flores and the hidden destiny of man. Nothing seemed especially hidden. It was all painfully clear. Listen, you said long ago, already pompous as a young student, that someday we would join issue, meaning there were important differences between us even then. I think it must have started in that seminar on Proudhon and the long arguments we had back and forth with old Larson about the decay of the religious foundations of civilization. Are all the traditions used up, the beliefs done for, the consciousness of the masses not yet ready for the next development? Is this the full crisis of disillusion? Has the filthy moment come when moral feeling dies, conscience disintegrates, and respect for liberty, law, public decency, all the rest, collapses in cowardice, decadence, blood? Old Proudhon's visions of darkness and evil can't be passed over, but we mustn't forget how quickly the visions of genius become the canned goods of the intellectuals. The canned sauerkraut of Spengler's Prussian socialism, the commonplaces of the wasteland outlook, the cheap mental stimulants of alienation, the cant and rant of pipsqueaks about inauthenticity and forlornness. I can't accept this foolish dreariness. We're talking about the whole life of mankind. The subject is too great, too deep for such weakness, cowardice. Too deep, too great, Shapiro. It torments me to insanity that you should be so misled. A merely aesthetic critique of modern history. After the wars and mass killings, you are too intelligent for this. You inherited rich blood. Your father peddled apples. I don't pretend that my position, on the other hand, is easy. We are survivors in this age, so theories of progress still become us, because we are intimately acquainted with the cost. To realize that you are a survivor is a shock. At the realization of such election, you feel like bursting into tears. As the dead go their way, you want to call to them, but they depart in a black cloud of faces, souls. They flow out in smoke from the extermination chimneys and leave you in the clear light of historical success, the technical success of the West. Then you know with a crash of the blood that mankind is making it in glory, though defended by the explosions of blood, unified by the horrible wars, instructed in our brutal stupidity by revolutions, by engineered famines, directed by ideologists, heirs of Marx and Hegel, and trained in the cunning of reason. Perhaps we, modern humankind, can it be, have done the nearly impossible, namely learned something. You know that the decline and the doom of civilization refuses to follow the model of antiquity. The old empires are shattered, but those same one-time powers are richer than ever. I don't say that the prosperity of Germany is altogether agreeable to contemplate, but there it is, less than 20 years after the demonic nihilism of Hitler destroyed it, and France, England. No, the analogy of the decline and fall of the classical world will not hold for us. Something else is happening, and that something lies closer to the vision of Comte, the results of rationally organized labor, than to that of Spengler. Of all the evils of standardization in the old bourgeois Europe of Spengler, perhaps the worst was the standardized pedantry of the Spenglers themselves. This coarse truculence, born in the gymnasium, in cultural drill, and administered by an old-fashioned bureaucracy. I intended in the country to write another chapter in the history of Romanticism as the form taken by plebeian envy and ambition in modern Europe. Emergent plebeian classes fought for food, powder, sexual privileges, of course, but they fought also to inherit the aristocratic dignity of the old regimes, which in the modern age might have claimed the right to speak of decline. In the sphere of culture, the newly risen educated classes cause confusion between aesthetic and moral judgments. They began with anger over the industrial defilement of landscapes, Ruskin's British Vales of Temple, and ended by losing sight of the old-fashioned moral characteristics of the Rushkins. Reaching at last the point of denying the humanity of the industrialized, banalized masses, it was easy for the wastelanders to be assimilated to totalitarianism. Here the responsibility of artists remains to be assessed. To have assumed, for instance, that the deterioration of language and its debasement was tantamount to dehumanization led straight to cultural fascism. I planned also to consider the whole question of models of imitatio in the history of civilization. After long study of the ancient regime, I was ready to risk a theory concerning the effects of the high traditions of the court, the politics, the theater of Louis XIV on French and therefore European personality. Circumstances of bourgeois privacy in the modern age deprived individuals of scope for grand passions, and it is here that one of the most fascinating and least amiable tendencies of the Romantics develops. One of the results of this sort of personal drama is that, to the colonial world, Western civilization dramatized itself as aristocratic. I had a chapter in progress when you visited called The American Gentleman, a short history of social climbing. And there was I, myself, in Ludeville as Squire Herzog, the Graf Potocki of the Berkshires. It was quite a funny twist of events, Shapiro. While you and Madeline were tossing your heads, coquetting, bragging, showing off your clean, sharp teeth, the learned badinage, I was trying to take stock of my position. I understood that Madeline's ambition was to take my place in the learned world, to overcome me. She was reaching her final elevation as queen of the intellectuals, the Castoron Bluestocking, and your friend Herzog writhing under this sharp, elegant heel. Ah, Shapiro, the Victor of Waterloo drew apart to shed bitter tears for the dead, slain under his orders. Not so, my ex-missus. She does not live between two contradictory testaments. She is stronger than Wellington. She wants to live in the delirious professions, as Valery calls them, trades in which the main instrument is your opinion of yourself and the raw material is your reputation or standing. As for your book, there is too much imaginary history in it. Much of it is simply utopian fiction. I will never change my mind about that. Nevertheless, I thought your idea about military... Oh, sorry. Nevertheless, I thought your idea about millennium... Whoa. Wait a second here. Nevertheless, I thought your idea about millennialism and paranoia were good. Here, you guys work it out for yourself. Milleniarism. Thanks. I'm done with that. Madeline, by the way, lured me out of the learned world, got in herself, slammed the door, and is still in there, gossiping about me. It was not terribly original, this idea of Shapiro's, but he did a good job. In my review, I tried to suggest that clinical psychologists might write fascinating histories, put professionals out of business, megalomania for the pharaohs and Caesars, melancholia in the Middle Ages, schizophrenia in the 18th century, and then this Bulgarian, Bendowich, seeing all power struggles in terms of paranoid mentality, a curious, creepy mind that one convinced that madness always rules the world. The dictator must have living crowds and also a crowd of corpses. The vision of mankind as a lot of cannibals running in packs, gibbering, bewailing its own murders, pressing out the living world as dead excrement. Do not deceive yourself, dear Moses Elkanah, with childish jingles and Mother Goose. Hearts quaking with cheap and feeble charity, or oozing potato love, have not written history. Shapiro's snarling teeth, his salivating greed, the danger of an ulcer in his belly, give him true insights too. Fountains of human blood that squirted from fresh graves. Limitless massacre. I never understood it. I took a list of the traits of paranoia from the psychiatrist recently. I asked him to jot them down for me. It might aid my understanding, I thought. He did this willingly. I put the scribbled paper in my wallet and studied it like the plagues of Egypt, just like Dom Saphardea Kinnim in the Haggadah. It read, pride, anger, excessive rationality, homosexual inclinations, competitiveness, mistrust of emotion, inability to bear criticism, hostile projections, delusions. It's all there, all. I've thought about Maddie in every category, and though the portrait isn't yet complete, I know I can't abandon a tiny child to her. Maddie is no Daisy. Daisy is a strict, moody woman, but dependable. Marco has come through all right. Abandoning the letter to Shapiro, it raised too many painful thoughts, and this was precisely the sort of thing he must avoid if he was not to lose the benefit of a holiday. He turned to his brother Alexander. Dear Shura, he wrote, I think I owe you $1,500. How about making it around 2,000? I need it in the process of pulling myself together.
Shura was a generous brother. The Herzogs had their characteristic family problems, but stinginess was not one of their traits. Moses knew that the rich man would push a button and say to his secretary, "Send a check to Screwloose Moses Herzog." His handsome, stout, white-haired brother, in his priceless suit, vicuna coat, Italian hat, his $1 million shave, and rosy manicured fingers with big rings, looking out of his limousine with princely hauteur. Shura knew everyone, paid off everyone, and despised everyone. Toward Moses, this contempt was softened by family feeling. Shura was your true disciple of Thomas Hobbes. Universal concerns were idiocy. Ask nothing better than to prosper in the belly of the Leviathan, and set a hedonistic example to the community. It amused Shura that his brother Moses should be so fond of him. Moses loved his relatives quite openly and even helplessly. His brother Willie, his sister Helen, even the cousins. It was childish of him. He knew that. He could only sigh at himself, and he should be so underdeveloped on that significant side of his nature. He sometimes tried to think, in his own vocabulary, whether this might be his archaic aspect, prehistoric. Trouble, associated with ancestor worship and totemism. Also, as I have been having legal troubles, I wonder whether you could recommend a lawyer. Perhaps one of Shura's own legal staff who would not charge Moses for his services. He now composed a letter in the head to Sander Himmelstein, the Chicago lawyer who had looked after him last autumn, after Madeline put him out of the house. Sander, last time we were in touch, I wrote from Turkey. Of all places, and yet that suited Sander in a way. It was Arabian Nights country, and Sander himself might have come out of the bazaar, for all that he had his office on the 14th floor of the Burnham building, up the street from City Hall. Herzog had met him in the steam bath at Postel's Health Club at Randolph and Wells. He was a short man, misshapen from the loss of part of his chest. In Normandy, he always said, he had probably been a sort of large dwarf when he enlisted. It must have been possible to get a commission in the judge advocate's branch. Though a dwarf, it made Herzog uneasy, perhaps, that he had been discharged from the Navy owing to his asthma, and never saw action, whereas this dwarf and hunchback was disabled by a mine near the beachhead. The wound had made a hunchback of him. Anyway, that was Sandor, with a proud, sharp, handsome face, pale mouth and sallow skin, grand nose, thin gray hair. In Turkey, I was in sad condition, partly because of the weather. Spring was struggling to come in, but the winds changed. The sky closed over the white mosques. It snowed. The trousered, mannish Turkish women veiled their stern faces. I never expected to see them striding so powerfully. Coal had been dumped in the street, but the laborers had not appeared to shovel it, so the furnace was out. Herzog drank plum brandy and tea in the cafe, and shafted and chafed his hands and worked his toes inside his shoes to keep the blood going. He was worried about his circulation at the time. To see the early flowers covered by snow increased his gloom. I sent you this belated bread and butter note to thank you and B for taking me under your roof. Acquaintances, not old friends. I'm sure I was a terrible house guest. Sick and angry, broken by this lousy grief, taking pills for my insomnia, but still unable to sleep, going about drugged, and the whiskey gave me tachycardia. I should have been in a padded cell. Gratitude. I was deeply grateful. But the politic gratitude of weakness of the sufferer furious underneath. Sander took me over. I was inept. He moved me into his house, far south, 10 blocks from the Illinois Central. Mattie had kept the car, clamping she needed it for Junie, to take her to the zoo and the lake. Sandor said, "You won't mind sleeping next to the booze, I guess," for the cot was unfolded beside the bar. The room was full of Carmel Himmelstein's high school crowd. "Get out!" Sander cried shrilly at the adolescents. "Can't see through the goddamn cigarette smoke. Look at these Coke bottles filled with butts." He turned on the air conditioner, and Moses, still red with the cold of the day, but with white circles under his eyes, held his valise, the same valise that now lay in his lap. Sander cleared the glasses from several shelves. "Unpack, kid," he said. "Put your stuff here. We eat in 20 minutes. Good chow. Sauerbraten. B's specialty." Obedient, Moses set out his things: toothbrush, razor, Desonex powder, sleeping pills, his socks, Shapiro's monograph, and an old pocket edition of Blake's poems. The slip of paper on which Dr. Edvig had listed the traits of paranoia was his bookmark. After dinner, that first night in the Himmelsteins' living room, Herzog began reluctantly to understand that in accepting Sandor's hospitality he had made still another characteristic mistake. "You'll get over this. That's all right. You'll make it," said Sander. "I'll put my dough on you. You're my boy." And Beatrice, with her black hair and her pretty pink mouth, which needed no rouge, said, "Moses, we know how you must feel." "The bitches come and the bitches go," said Sander. "My whole practice almost is these bitches. You should know what they carry on and what happens in the city of Chicago." He shook his heavy head, and his lips came together with the pressure of disgust. "If she wants to go, fuck her. Let her go. You'll be okay. So you were a sucker. Big deal. Every man is a sucker for some type of broad. I always got clobbered by the blue-eyed kind myself, but I had the sense to fall in love with this beautiful pair of brown eyes. Isn't she great?" "She certainly is." It had to be said, and it was actually not too difficult. Moses had not lived 40-odd years without learning to get through these moments. Among narrow Puritans, this is lying, but with civilized people only civility. "I'll never know what she saw in a wreck like me. Anyway, Moses, you just stay with us for a while. At a time like this, you shouldn't be without friends. Sure, I know you have family of your own in this town. I see your brothers at Fritzl's. I talked to your middle brother just the other day, Willie. He's a fine fellow. Very active in Jewish life, too," said Sander. "Not like that Macher Alexander. Always some scandal about him. Now he's connected with the juice racket, and next with Jimmy Hoffa. And then he's in with the Dirksen bunch. Well, okay, your brothers are big shots, but they'd make you eat your heart out. They'll probably ask. Here, nobody will ask any questions. With us, you can just let yourself go," said Beatrice. "Well, I don't understand this thing at all," said Moses. "Mattie and I had our ups and downs from the start, but things were improving. Last spring, we discussed the marriage and whether we were getting along well enough to continue. A practical question came up, whether I should tie myself up with Elise. She said that as soon as she finished her thesis, we'd have a second child. "I'll tell you," said Sandor. "It's your own frigging fault, too, if you want my opinion." "Mine? What do you mean?" "Because you're a highbrow and married highbrow broad. Somewhere in every intellectual is a dumb prick. You guys can't answer your own questions. Still, I see hope for you, Moses. What hope? You're not like those other university phonies. You're a mensch. What good are those effing eggheads? It takes an ignorant bastard like me to fight liberal causes. Those silk-stocking Yale squares may have a picture of Leonard Hand in the office, but when it comes to getting mixed up in Trumbull Park, or fighting those yellow bellies in Deerfield, or standing up for a man like Tompkins. Sander was proud of his record in the case of Tompkins, a Negro in the Postal Service whom he had defended. Well, I suppose they were out to get Tompkins because he was a Negro, said Herzog. But unfortunately, he was a drunk. You told me that yourself, and there was a question as to his competence. Don't go around repeating that, said Sandor. It'll be used the wrong way. You going to blab what I told you confidentially? It was a question of justice. Aren't there any white drunks on civil service? Not much. Sandor, Beatrice, I feel terrible. Another divorce out again at my time of life. I can't take it. I don't know. It feels like death. Shush. What are you talking? Said Sandor. It's pitiful because of the kid. But you'll get over it. At that time, when you thought, and I agreed that I shouldn't be alone, perhaps I really should have been alone, Herzog wrote. Look, I'll handle the whole thing for you, Sandor assured him. You'll come out of this, Drex, smelling like a roast. Leave it to me, will you? Don't you trust me? You think I'm not leveling with you? I ought to have taken a room at the Quadrangle Club. You can't be left to yourself, said Sandor. You're not the type. A human being, a mensch. Your heart has been shat on. And you have about as much practical sense as my 10-year-old children. You poor bastard. I'm going to shake this off. I'm not going to be a victim. I hate the victim bit, said Moses. Himmelstein sat in his wing chair, his feet tucked under his short belly. His eyes were moist, the color of freshly sliced cucumber with fine lashes. He chewed a cigar. His ugly nails were polished. He had his manicure at the Palmer House. A strong-minded bitch, he said. Terrifically attractive. Loves to make up her mind. Once decided, decided forever. What a willpower. It's a type. Still, she must have loved you once, Moses, said B. She spoke very, very slowly. That was her manner. Her dark brown eyes were set within strong orbital bones. Her lips were pink and vivid. Moses did not want to meet her gaze. He would have to hold it long and earnestly, and nothing would come of it. He knew he had her sympathy, but she should never approve of him. I don't think she loved me, said Moses. I'm sure she did. It was the middle-class female solidarity defending a nice girl from charges of calculation and viciousness. Nice girls marry for love, but should they fall out of love, they must be free to love another. No decent husband will oppose the heart. This is orthodox. Not utterly bad, but a new orthodoxy. Anyway, thought Moses, he was in no position to quarrel with Beatrice. He was in her house, taking comfort from her. You don't know Madeline, he said. When I met her, she needed a lot of help. The sort only a husband can provide. I know how long. Endless. People's stories are when they have grievances, and how tedious for everyone. I happen to think she's a nice person, said B. At first she looked stuck up and acted suspicious, but when I got to know her, she turned out to be friendly and very nice. Basically, she must be a good person. Shit! People are nice, most of them. You've got to give 'em a chance, said Sandor, sallow and handsome. Maddie planned it all out, said Herzog. Why couldn't she break off before I signed the lease? Because she has to keep a roof over the kid's head, said Sandor. What do you expect? What I expect? Herzog stood up, struggling for words. His face was white. His eyes dilated, fixed. He stared at Sander, who was seated like a sultan, the small heels gathered under his bulging belly. Then he became aware that Beatrice, with her pretty lustrous look, was warning him not to anger Sandor. His blood pressure was liable to shoot up dangerously when he was crossed. Herzog wrote, I was thankful for your friendship. I was in a state, though, one of those states in which one makes great impossible demands. In anger, people become dictatorial, hard to take. I was trapped there, sleeping next to the bar. My heart went out to poor Tompkins. No wonder he hit the bottle when Sandor took him over. You're not going to fight for the kid's custody, are you? Sandor said to Herzog. Suppose I do. Well, said Sandor, speaking as a lawyer, I can see you with the jury. They'll look at Madeline, blooming and lovely, and you, baggard and gray-haired, and bam, there goes your custody suit. That's the jury system. Dumber than cavemen, those bastards. I know this isn't easy for you to hear, but I better say it. Guys at our time of life must face facts. Facts? Said Herzog. Faint, groping, outraged. I know, said Sandor. I'm 10 years older, but after 40, it's all the same. If you can get it up once a week, you should be grateful. Beatrice tried to restrain Sandor, but he said, Shut up! He then turned to Moses again, shaking his head so that it gradually sank toward his disfigured breast, and his shoulder blades jutted behind, coracoid, through the white-on-white shirt. What the fuck does he know what it is to face facts? All he wants is everybody should love him. If not, he's going to scream and holler. All right, after D-Day, I lay smashed up in that effing limey hospital, a cripple. Why? Christ! I had to walk out under my own power. And what about his pal, Valentin Gersbach? There's a man for you. That gimpy redhead knows what real suffering is. But he lives it up. 3 men with 6 legs couldn't get around like that effing peg leg. It's okay, B. Moses can take it. Otherwise, he'd just another Professor Jerk. He'd be just another Professor Jerk. I wouldn't even bother with the son of a bitch. Herzog was incoherent with anger. What do you mean? Should I die because of my hair? What about the child? Now don't stand there rubbing your hands like a goddamn fool. Christ, I hate a fool, Sandor shouted. His green eyes were violently clear. His lips were continually tensing. He must have been convinced that he was cutting the dead weight of deception from Herzog's soul, and his long white fingers, thumbs and forefingers, worked nervously. What? Die? Hair? What the hell are you babbling? I only said they'd give the kid to a young mother. Madeline put you up to that. She planted this, too, to keep me from suing. She's nothing. I'm trying to tell you for your own good. This time, she calls the shots. She wins, you lose. Maybe she wants somebody else. Does she? Did she tell you that? She told me nothing. I said maybe. Now calm down. Pour him a drink, B. Out of his own bottle. He doesn't like scotch. Beatrice went to fetch Herzog's own bottle of Guggenheimer 86 proof. Now, said Sandor, stop this baloney. Don't be a clown, man. His look changed, and he let some kindness flow toward Herzog. Well, when you suffer, you really suffer. You're a real, genuine old Jewish type that digs the emotions. I'll give you that. I understand it. I grew up on Sangamon Street, remember, when a Jew was still a Jew? I know about suffering. We're on the same identical network. Herzog, the passenger, noted. For the life of me, I couldn't understand. I often thought I was going to have apoplexy, to burst. The more comfort you gave me, the closer I came to death's door. But what was I doing? Why was I in your house? It must have been funny how I grieved, looking from my room at the leafless weeds in back, brown delicate frames of ragweed, milkweed with the discharged pods gaping, or else gazing at the dark gray face of the television. On Sunday morning, early, Sander called Herzog into the living room. "Man," he said, "I found one hell of an insurance policy for you." Moses, trying his robe about him as he came from his bed by the bar, didn't understand. "What?" "We want to get you a terrific policy to cover the kid." "What's this about?" "I told you last week, but you mustn't have been thinking of other things. You must have been thinking of other things. If you get sick, have an accident, lose an eye, even if you go nuts, Junie will be protected." "But I'm going to Europe and I have travel insurance." "That's if you die. But here, even if you have a mental breakdown and have to go to an institution, the kid still gets her monthly support." "Who says I'm breaking down?" "Listen, you think I'm doing this for myself? I'm in the middle here," said Sander, stamping the bare foot on the thick pile of the carpet. Sunday, with grey fog from the lake and the oar-boats lowing like waterborne cattle. You could hear the emptiness of the hulls. Herzog would have given anything to be a deckhand bound for Duluth. "Either you want my legal advice or you don't," said Sandor. "I want to do the best for you, for all of you." "True? Well, here I am to prove it. You've taken me into your house. Okay, so let's talk sense. With Madeline, you're not going to have trouble. She gets no alimony. She'll be married soon. I took her to lunch at Fritzl's, and guys who haven't given Sander H. the time of day for years came running with a hard-on, tripping over themselves. That includes the rabbi of my temple. She's some dish." "You're a lunatic, and I know what she is." "What do you mean?" "She's less of a whore than most. We're all whores in this world, and don't you forget it." "I know damn well I'm a whore, and you're an outstanding schnook. I realize, at least the eggheads tell me so. But I bet you a suit of clothes you're a whore too. Do you know what a mass man is, Himmelstein?" Sander scowled. "How's that?" "A mass man. A man of the crowd. The soul of the mob. Cutting everybody down to size." "What soul of the mob?" "Don't get highfalutin. I'm talking facts, not shit. And you think a fact is what's nasty? Facts are nasty. You think they're true because they're nasty. And it's all too much for you. Who told you you were such a prince? Your mother did her own wash. You took boarders. Your old man was a two-bit moonshiner. I know you Herzogs and you Yeeches. Don't give me that hoity-toity. I'm a kike myself, and got my diploma in a stinking night school. Okay, now let's both knock off this crap, dreamy boy." Herzog, subdued, much shaken, had no answer. What had he come here for? Help? A forum for his anger? Indignation for his injustices? But it was Sander's forum, not his. This fierce dwarf with protruding teeth and deep lines in his face. His lopsided breast protruded from his green pajamas top. But this was Sander's bad, angry state, thought Herzog. He could be attractive, too, generous, convivial, even witty. The lava of that heart may have pushed those ribs out of shape, and the force of that hellish tongue made his teeth protrude. "Very well, Moshe Herzog, if you must be pitiable. Sue for aid and suture. You will put yourself always, inevitably, in the hands of these angry spirits, blasting you in their truth. This is what your masochism means. Mines esse inshemali. The good are attracted by men's perceptions and think not for themselves. You must cleanse the gates of vision by self-knowledge, by experience. Besides, which opposition is true friendship? So they tell me. You want to take care of your own kid, don't you? Said Sandor. Sure I do. But you told me the other day that I might as well forget about her and that she'd grow up a stranger to me. That's right. She won't even know you next time you see her. Sandor was thinking of his own kids, those hamsters, not my daughter, made of finer clay. She won't forget me. I don't believe it, said Herzog. As the lawyer, I have a social obligation to the child. I've got to protect her. You? I'm her father. You may crack up, or else die. Maddie is just as liable to die. Why don't we write the insurance on her? She'd never let you. That's not part of a woman's deal. It's the man's deal. Not this man's. Madeline swings her weight like a male. She made all these decisions to take the kid and throw me in the street. She thinks she can be both mother and father. I'll pay the premiums on her life. Sanders suddenly began to yell. I don't give a shit about her. I don't give a shit about you. I'm looking after that child. What makes you so sure I'll die first? And is this the woman you love? Sanders said in a lower tone. Apparently, he had remembered his dangerously high blood pressure. An elaborate effort occurred which involved his pale eyes and his lips, and which pitted his chin. He said more evenly, I'd take that policy myself if I could pass the physical. It would give me a pleasure to croak and leave my bee a rich widow. I'd like that. Then she would go to Miami and dye her hair. That's right, while I turn green like an old penny in my box, and she screws around. I don't grudge her. All right, Sander, said Herzog. He wanted to end this talk. Just now I don't feel like making arrangements for my death. What's so great about your effing death? Sander cried. His figure straightened. He stood very close to Herzog, who was somewhat frightened by his shrillness and stared down, wide-eyed, at the face of his host. It was strong-cut and coarsely handsome. The small mustache bristled. A fierce green milky poison rose to his eyes. His mouth twisted. I'm getting out of this case, Himmelstein began to scream. What's the matter with you? Herzog said. Where's Beatrice? Beatrice! But Mrs. Himmelstein only shut her bedroom door. She'll go to the shyster firm. For God's sake, stop screaming. They'll kill you. Sander, quit this. Put you over a barrel. Tear your hide off. Herzog held his ears. I can't stand it. Tie your guts in knots. Son of a bitch, they'll put a meter on your nose and charge you for breathing. You'll be locked up back and front, and then you'll think about your death. You'll pray for it. A coffin will look better to you than a sports car. But I didn't leave Madeline. I've done this to guise myself. What harm did I do her? The court doesn't care. You signed papers. Did you read them? No, I took your word. They'll throw the book at you in court. She's the mother, the female. She's got the tits. They'll crush you. But I'm not guilty of anything. She hates you. Sander no longer screamed. He had resumed his normal loudness. Jesus, you don't know anything, he said. You, an educated man. Thank God my old pa didn't have the dough to send me to the U of C. I worked in the Davis store and went to John Marshall. Education? It's a laugh. You don't know what goes on. Moses was shaken. He began to reconsider. All right, he said. What's all right? I'll take a policy on my life. Not as a favor to me. Not as a favor. It's a big bite. $418. I'll find the money, Sanders said. All right, my boy. Finally, you make some sense. Now, what about some breakfast? I'll cook porridge. In his green paisley pajamas, he set off for the kitchen on his long, slipperless feet. Following in the corridor, Herzog heard a cry from Sandor at the kitchen sink. Look at this crap. Not a pot, not a dish. There isn't a spoon that's clean. It stinks of garbage. It's just a sewer here. The old dog, obese and bald, escaped in fear, claws rapping on the tiles. Click, 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 click. Spendthrift bitches. He shouted at the women of his house. Friggin' lice. All they're good for is to wag their asses at the dress shops and play gidgee in the bushes. Then they'll come home and gorge cake and leave plates smeared with chocolate in the fucking sink. That's what gives them the pimples. Easy, Sandor. Do I ask for much? The old veteran cripple runs up and down City Hall from courtroom to courtroom, out to 26 in California. For them, do they care if I have to suck up to all kinds of pricks to get a little business? Sandor began to rake out the sink. He threw eggshells and orange rinds into the corner beside the garbage pail. Coffee grounds. He worked himself into a rage and began to smash dishes and glassware. His long fingers, like those of hunchback, gripped the plates soiled with icing, without losing beauty of gesture. Amazing. He shattered them on the wall. He knocked over the dish drainer and the soap powder, and then he wept with anger, and also at himself, that he should have such emotions. His open mouth and jutting teeth, the long hairs, streamed from his disfigured breast. Moses, they're killing me. Killing their father. The daughters lay listening in their rooms. Young Sheldon was in Jackson Park with his scout troop. Beatrice did not appear. We don't have to have porridge, said Herzog. No, I'll wash a pot. He was still shedding tears. Under the torrential tap, his manicured fingers scrubbed the aluminum with steel wool. When he grew calmer, he said, You know, Moses, I've been to a psychiatrist about these effing dishes. They cost me $20 an hour. Moses, what am I going to do with my kids? Sheldon's going to be all right. Tessie's maybe not so bad. But Carmel? I don't know how to handle her. I'm afraid the boys are getting into her pants already. Pruff, while you're here, I don't ask anything from you. In return for the bed and board, he meant. But I'd appreciate it if you'd take an interest in her mental development. This is her chance to know an intellectual, a famous person, an authority. Will you talk to her? About what? Books, ideas, take her for a walk, discuss with her. Please, Moses, I'm begging you. Well, of course I'll talk to her. I asked the rabbi, but what good are these reform rabbis? I know I'm a vulgar bastard, the terrible-tempered Mr. Bang. I work for these kids. He squeezes the poor, buys credit paper from merchants who sell fancy goods on installments to prostitutes on the south side. And it's all very well for me to surrender my daughter, but his little hamsters have to have elevating discourses. If Carmel was a little older, I'd say marry her. Moses, pale and startled, said, She's a very attractive girl. Far too young, of course. Sander put his long arm about Herzog's waist and drew him close. Don't be such a rolling stone, Professor. Start leading a normal life. Where the hell haven't you been? Canada, Chicago, Paris, New York, Massachusetts. Your brothers have done okay right here in this town. Of course, what's good enough for Alexander and Willie isn't good enough for a maqueur like you, Moses E. Herzog. He has no money in the bank, but you can look up his name in the library. I hoped that Madeline and I would settle down. Out in the sticks? Don't be nuts. With that chick? Are you kidding? Come back to the hometown. You're a West Side Jew. I used to see you as a kid in the Jewish People's Institute. Slow down. Stop knocking yourself out. I love you better than my own effing family. You never pulled that phony Harvard stuff on me. Stick with the folks, with good hearts, with love. Jesus, what do you say? He drew away with big, handsome, sallow head a little distance to look into Herzog's eyes, and Herzog felt the circuit of affection enclosing them again. Himmelstein's face, with its long yellow grooves, was joyful. Can you sell that dump in the Berkshires? I might. Hell, it's settled then. Take a loss if you have to. They've ruined Hyde Park, but you don't want to live with those long-hair schmoes anyhow. Rent in my neighborhood. Though he was tired out, and suffering at heart like a fool, Herzog listened like a child to a tale. Get yourself a housekeeper, closer to your own age, and a good lay, too. What's wrong with that? Or we'll find you a gorgeous brown-skinned housekeeper. No more Japs for you. What do you mean? You know what I mean. Or maybe what you need is a girl who survived the concentration camps and would be grateful for a good home. And you and I will lead the life. We'll go to the Russian Bath on North Avenue. They hit me at Omaha Beach, but screw 'em all. I'm still going. We'll live it up. We'll find an Orthodox shul, enough of this temple junk. You and me will track down a good shazan, forming his lips so that the almost invisible mustache thinly appeared. Sandor began to sing. Me pene, chatounet, galino, marzino. And for our sins we are exiled from our land. You and me, a pair of old-time Jews. He held Moses with his dew-green eyes. You're my boy, my innocent, kind-hearted boy. He gave Moses a kiss. Moses felt the potato love. Amorphous, swelling, hungry, indiscriminate, cowardly potato love. Oh, you sucker, cried Moses to himself in the train. Sucker! I left you money for an emergency. You turned it all over to Madeline to buy clothes. Were you her lawyer or mine? I might have understood from the way he spoke of his female clients and assaulted all the men. But my God, how did I get into all of that? Why did I become involved with him at all? I must have wanted such absurd things to happen to me. I was so far gone in foolishness that even they, those Himmelsteins, knew more than I, and showed me the facts of life and taught me the truth. Revenged with hate on my own proud inanities. In the mild end of the afternoon, later at the waterside, in Wood's Hole, waiting for the ferry, he looked through the green darkness at the net of bright reflections on the bottom. He loved to think about the power of the sun, about light, about the ocean. The purity of the air moved him. There was no stain in the water where schools of minnows swam. Herzog sighed and said to himself, Praise God, praise God. His breathing had become freer. His heart was greatly stirred by the open horizon. The deep colors, the faint iodine pungency of the Atlantic rising from weeds and mollusks, the white, fine, heavy sand, but principally by the green transparency as he looked down to the stony bottom webbed with golden lines. Never still. If his soul could cast a reflection so brilliant and so intensely sweet, he might beg God to make such use of him. But that would be too simple. But that would be too childish. The actual sphere is not cut like this, but turbulent, angry. A vast human action is going on. Death watches. So if you have some happiness, conceal it. And when your heart is full, keep your mouth shut also. He had moments of sanity, but he couldn't maintain the balance for very long. The ferry came. He boarded it, pulling his hat tight in the sea wind, slightly shamefaced because he enjoyed this typical moment of a holiday. The cars were loaded in a cloud of blowing sand and marl while Herzog looked down from the upper deck. During the crossing, he rested his feet on his upended valise, taking the sun, watching the boats through half-lidded eyes. In Vineyard Haven, he caught a cab at the dock. It turned right on the main street parallel to the harbor, lined with big trees, water, sails on the right, and the road passing under leaves filled with sun. Big gilt letters shone on red storefronts. The shopping center was as bright as a stage set. The taxi went slowly, as if the old engine had a heart condition. It passed the public library and pillared driveways, great lyre-shaped elm trees, and sycamores with patches of white bark. He noted the sycamores. These trees held an important place in his life. The green of evening was settling in, and the blue of the water, when your eyes turned from the shadows of the grass, seemed paler and paler. The cab turned right again toward the shore, and Herzog got out, missing half of the driver's directions as he paid. Down the stairs, up again. I get it. Okay. He saw Libby waiting on the porch in a bright dress and waved to her. She blew him a kiss. At once he knew that he had made a mistake. Vineyard Haven was not the place for him. It was lovely, and Libby was charming, one of the most charming women in the world, but I should have never have come. It just isn't right, he thought. He appeared to be looking for the wooden treads on the slope. Hesitating, a strong-looking man holding his valise in a double grip like a player about to throw a forward pass. His hands were broad, heavily veined, not the hands of a man whose occupation was mental, but of a born bricklayer or house painter. The breeze swelled out his right clothes, and then fitted them tightly to his body. And what a look he had, such a face! Just then his state of being was so curious that he was compelled himself to see it. Eager, grieving, fantastic, dangerous, crazed, and to the point of death, comical. It was enough to make a man pray to God to remove this great bone-breaking burden of selfhood and self-development, give himself a failure back to the species for a primitive cure. But this was becoming the up-to-date and almost conventional way of looking at any single life. In this view, the body itself, with its 2 arms and vertical length, was compared to the cross, on which you knew the agony of consciousness and separate being. For that matter, he had been taking this primitive cure administered by Madeline, Sandor, etc., so that his recent misfortunes might be seen as a collective project, himself participating, to destroy his vanity and his pretensions to a personal life so that he might disintegrate and suffer and hate, like so many others, not on anything so distinguished as a cross, but down in the mire of post-Renaissance, post-humanistic, post-Cartesian disillusion next door to the void. Everybody was in the act. History gave everyone a free ride. The very Himmelsteins, who had never even read a book of metaphysics, were touting the void as if it were so much soluble real estate. This little demon was impregnated with modern ideas, and one in particular excited his terrible little heart. You must sacrifice your poor, squawking, niggardly individuality, which may be nothing anyway from an analytic viewpoint, but a persistent infantile megalomania from a Marxian point of view, a stinking little bourgeois property to historical necessity, and to truth. And truth is true only as it brings down more disgrace and dreariness upon human beings, so that if it shows anything except evil, it is illusion and not truth. But of course he, Herzog, predictably, bucking his such trends, had characteristically, obstinately, defiantly, blindly but without sufficient courage or intelligence, tried to be a marvelous Herzog, a Herzog who perhaps clumsily tried to live out marvelous qualities vaguely comprehended. Granted, he had gone too far, beyond his talents and his powers, but this was the cruel difficulty of a man who had strong impulses, even faith, but lacked clear ideas. What if he failed? Did that really mean that there was no faithfulness, no generosity, no sacred quality? Should he have been a plain, unambitious Herzog? No, and Madeline would never have married such a type. What she had been looking for, high and low, was precisely an ambitious Herzog, in order to trip him, bring him low, knock him sprawling, and kick out his brains with a murderous bitch foot. Oh, what a confusion he had made! What a waste of intelligence and feeling! When he thought of the endless, anxious tedium of courtship and marriage, with all that he had invested in arrangements, merely in practical measures, in trains and planes and hotels and department stores and banks where he had banked, in hospitals, in doctors and drugs, in debts, and for himself the nights of rigid insomnia, the yellow boring afternoons, the trials by sexual combat, and all the horrible egomania of it, he wondered that he had survived at all. He wondered even why he shouldn't have wanted to survive. Others in his generation wore themselves out, died of strokes, of cancer, willed their own deaths, conceivably. But he, despite all blunders, fucky knuckles that he was, he must be cunning, though. Tough. He survived. And for what? What was he hanging around for? To follow his career of personal relationships until his strength at last gave out, only to be smashing success in a private realm, a king of hearts, amorous Herzog, seeking love and embracing his Wandas, Zinkas, and Ramonas, one after another? But this is a female pursuit. This hugging and heartbreak is for women. The occupation of a man is in duty, in use of civility, in politics, in the Aristotelian sense. Now then, why am I arriving here in Vineyard Haven, on a holiday no less, heartbroken and gussied up, with my Italian pants and my fountain pens and my grief, to bother and pester poor Libby, and exploit her affections, forcing her to pay off because I was so kind and decent when her last husband, Erickson, went off his rocker and tried to stab her and take the gas himself? At which time, yes, I was very helpful. But if she hadn't been so very beautiful, sexual, and obviously attracted to me, would I have been such a willing friend and helper? And it's not much to be pleased with that I bother her now, a bride of a few months, with my troubles. Have I come to collect the quid pro quo? Turn around, Moshe Hanan, and catch the next ferry back. All you needed was a train ride. It has turned the trick. Libby came down the path to greet him, and gave him a kiss. She was dressed for the evening in an orange or poppy-colored cocktail dress. It took Moses an extra moment to determine whether the fragrance she smelled came from the nearby bed of peonies or from her neck and shoulders. She was unaffectedly happy to see him. By fair means or not, he had made a friend of her. "How are you?" "I'm not going to say," said Herzog. "It's not right." "What are you talking about?" "You've been traveling for hours. Come inside and meet Arnold. Sit down and have a drink." "You are funny." She laughed at him. and he was obliged to laugh with her. Sisler came out on the porch, a man in his 50s, untidy and sleepy but cheerful, and began to make welcoming sounds in his deep voice. He had on a pair of large pink slacks with a rubberized waistband. "He says he's already on his way back, Arnold. I told you he was funny. You traveled all this way to tell us? Come in, come in. I was going to light a fire. It gets colder in an hour, and people are coming to dinner. What about a drink? Scotch or bourbon? Maybe you'd like a swim instead." Sisler gave him a broad, amiable, wrinkled, black-eyed smile. These eyes were small, and there were spaces between his teeth. He was bald, his black hair was thick and projected, like one of those large tree mushrooms that grow on the mossy side of a trunk. Libby had married a comfortable, wise old dog, the kind who always turned out to have large reserves of understanding and humanity. In the brighter light of the seaward side of the house she looked extremely well, happy, her face tanned and smooth. On her mouth she wore poppy-colored lipstick, and gold mesh jewelry on her arm, a heavy gold chain on her neck. She had aged a little. She must be 38 or 39, was his guess, but her dark, close-set eyes, which gave her a fluid and merged gaze, she had a delicate, lovely nose, were clearer than he had ever seen them. She was in the time of life when the later action of heredity begins. The blemishes of ancestors appear, a spot or the deepening of wrinkles, at first increasing a woman's beauty. Death, the artist, very slowly putting in his first touches. Now, to Sisler, it couldn't matter less. He had already accepted this, would rumble on in his Russian accent, and be the same forthright businessman to the day of his death. When that moment came, because of his bunchy black back hair, he would have to die lying on his side. Ideas that depopulate the world. But as Herzog accepted a drink, and heard himself in a clear voice saying thanks, and saw how he sat down in the chintz-covered chair, his psychological reading suggested that it might not be Sisler whose deathbed he saw in this vision, but some other person who had a wife. Maybe it was even himself, who was dying in fantasy. He had had a wife, 2 wives, and been the object of such death-flavored fantasies himself. Now, the first requirement of stability in a human being was that the said human being should really desire to exist. This is what Spinoza says. It is necessary for happiness. Felicitas. He can't behave well. Bene agere, or live well. Bene vivere. If he himself doesn't want to live. But if it's also natural, as psychology says, to kill mentally, 1 thought murder a day keeps the psychiatrist away. Then the desire to exist is not steady enough to support a good life. Do I want to exist or want to die? But at this social moment, he couldn't expect to answer such questions, and he swallowed freezing bourbon from the clinking glass instead. The whiskey went down, burning pleasurably in his chest like a tangled string of fire. Below, he saw the pockmarked beach, the flaming sunset on the water. The ferry was returning. As the sun went down, its wide hull suddenly filled with electric lights. In the calm sky, a helicopter steered toward Hyannis Port, where the Kennedys lived. Big doings there once. The power of nations. What do we know about it? Moses felt a sharp pang at the thought of the late president. I wonder what I would say to a president in actual conversation. He smiled a little as he remembered his mother boasting to Aunt Zephora about him. What a little tongue it has! Moshe could talk to the president. But at the time, the president was Harding, or was it Coleridge? Meantime, the conversation was going on. Sizzler was trying to make Moses feel at home. I must seem obviously shook up, and Libby looked concerned. "Ah, don't worry about me," said Moses. "I'm just a little excited by things," he laughed. Libby and Sizzler exchanged a look, but grew easier. "This is a fine house you have. Is it rented?" "I own it," said Sizzler. "Is that so? Wonderful place. Summer only, isn't it? You could winterize it easily." "It would cost 15 grand or more," said Sizzler. "That much? I suppose labor and materials are higher on this island." "I could do the work myself, sure," said Sizzler. "But we come here to rest. I understand you're a property owner, too." "Louisville, Massachusetts," said Herzog. "Where is that?" "Berkshires, near the Connecticut corner of the state." "Must be a beautiful spot of country." "Oh, it's beautiful, all right. Too remote, though. Far from everything. What about another drink?" Perhaps Sizzler thought the liquor would calm him. "Moses probably wants to clean up after his trip," said Libby. "I'll show him his room." Sizzler carried Herzog's valise up. "This is a fine old staircase," said Moses. "Couldn't duplicate it today for thousands. They put a lot of work into it for a summer house. 60 years ago they still had craftsmen," said Sizzler. "Take a look at the doors. Bird's eye maple. Here's where you are. I think you got everything here. Towels, soap. Some neighbors are coming this evening. One single lady, a singer, Miss Elissa Thurnwald, divorced." The room was wide and comfortable, and had a view of the bay. The bluish beacons of the 2 points, east and west chop, were lighted. "This is a fine spot," said Herzog. "Unpack. Make yourself at home. Don't be in any hurry to go. I know you were a good friend to Libby when she was up against it. She told me how you protected her from the blow-top, Erickson. He even tried to stab the poor kid. She didn't have anybody but you to return to. As a matter of fact, Erickson had nobody else to turn to, either. What's the difference?" Sizzler said, with his rugged face a little averted, but only so that his small, shrewd eyes might see Herzog from the angle required for the fullest consideration. "You stood up for her. To me, that's everything. Not just because I love the kid, either, but because there's so many creeps in circulation. You got trouble, I can see that. Jumping out of your skin. You got a soul, haven't you, Moses?" He shook his head, smoking his cigarette, with 2 stained fingers pressed to his mouth. His voice rumbling. "Can't dump the son of a bitch, can we? Terrible handicap of soul." Moses answered in a low voice. "I'm not even sure I've got the thing still." "I would say yes." "Well," he turned his wrist to catch the last of the light on his gold watch. "You got time to rest up a little?" He left, and Moses lay on the bed a while, a good mattress, a clean comforter. He lay for a quarter of an hour without thinking, lips parted, legs and arms extended, breathing quietly as he gazed at the figures of the wallpaper until they were hidden in darkness. When he stood up, it was not to wash and dress, but to write a farewell note on the maple desk. There was stationery in the drawer. "Have to go back. Not able to stand kindness at this time. Feelings, heart, everything in strange condition. Unfinished business. Bless you both, and much happiness. Toward end of summer, perhaps, if you will give me a rain check. Gratefully, Moses." He stole away from the house. The Sizzlers were in the kitchen. Sizzler was making a clatter with the ice trays. Moses rapidly descended and was out of the screen door with frantic swiftness. Softly, he passed through the bushes into the neighboring lot, up the path, and back to the ferry slip. He took a cab to the airport. All he could get at this hour was a Boston flight. He took it and caught a plane for Idlewild at Boston Airport. At 11 p.m. he was lying in his own bed, drinking warm milk and eating a peanut butter sandwich. It had cost him a pretty penny, all of this travel. He kept Geraldine Portney's letter always on his bed table, and he picked it up now and reread it before he fell asleep. He tried to remember how he had felt when he had first read it in Chicago after some delay. Dear Mr. Herzog, I am Geraldine Portney, Lucas Ashfalter's friend. You may remember. Moses had read faster. The script was feminine, progressive school printing, turned cursive, and the I's dotted with curious little open circles. Trying to swallow the whole letter at once, turning the pages to see whether the gist of the thing was underscored anywhere. Actually, I took your course in romantics as social philosophers. We differed about Rousseau and Karl Marx. I have come around to your view that Marx expressed metaphysical hopes for the future of mankind. I took what he said about materialism far too literally. My view? It's common, and why does she want to make me dangle like this? Why doesn't she get on with it? He had tried again to find the point, but all those circular open dots fell on his vision like snow and masked the message. You probably never noticed me, but I liked you, and as a friend of Lucas Ashfalter, he just adores you. He says you are just a feast of the most human qualities. I have, of course, heard a lot about you, growing up in Lucas, old neighborhood, and how you played basketball in the Boys' Brotherhood of the Republic in the good old Chicago days on Division Street. An uncle of mine by marriage was one of the coaches, Jules Hankin. I think I do recall Hankin. He wore a blue cardigan and parted his hair in the middle. I don't want you to get me wrong. I don't want to meddle in your affairs, and I am not an enemy of Madeline's. I sympathize with her, too. She is so vivacious, intelligent, and such a charmer, and has been so warm and frank with me. For quite a while I admired her, and as a younger woman was very pleased by her confidences. Herzog flushed. Her confidences would include his sexual disgrace. And as a former student, I was of course intrigued to hear of your private life, but was also surprised by her freedom and willingness to talk, and soon saw she wanted to win me over. For some reason, Lucas warned me to look out for something dykey. But then any excuse me. Lucas warned me to look out for something dykey. But then any intense feeling between members of the same sex is often and unjustly under suspicion. My scientific background has taught me to make more cautious generalizations and resist this creeping psychoanalysis of ordinary conduct. But she did want to win me to her side, although far too subtle to pour it on, as they say. She told me that you had very fine human and intellectual qualities, though neurotic and with an intolerable temper, which often frightened her. However, she added, you could be great, and after 2 bad loveless marriages, perhaps you would devote yourself to the work you were meant to do. Emotional relationships you were not really good at. It was soon obvious that she would never have given herself to a man who lacked distinction of intelligence or feeling. Madeline said that for the first time in her life she knew clearly what she was doing. Until now it was all confusion, and there were even gaps of time she couldn't account for. In marrying you, she was in this mix-up and might have remained so but for a certain break. It is extremely exciting to talk with her. She gives a sense of a significant encounter with life, a beautiful, brilliant person with a fate of her own. Her experiences are rich or pregnant. What is this? Herzog had thought. Is she going to tell me that Madeline is going to have a child? Gersbach's child? No. How wonderful! What luck for me! If she has a kid out of wedlock, I can petition for Junie's custody. Eagerly, he had devoured the rest of the page, turned over. No, Madeline was not pregnant. She'd be far too clever to let that happen. She owned her survival to intelligence. It was part of her sickness to be shrewd. She was not pregnant then. I was not merely a graduate student who helped with the child, but a confidant. Your little girl is greatly attached to me, and I find her a most extraordinary child. Exceptional, really. I love Junie with more than the usual affection. Oh, far more than one has for the children one meets in this way. I understand the Italians are supposed to be the most child-oriented culture in the West, judged by the figure of the Christ child in Italian painting. But obviously, Americans have their own craze about child psychology. Everything is done for children, ostensibly. To be fair, I think Madeline is not bad with little June, basically. She tends to be authoritarian. Mr. Gersbach, who has an ambiguous position in this household, is very amusing to the child, on the whole. She calls him Uncle Val, and often see him giving her a piggyback or tossing her in the air. Here Herzog had set his teeth, angry, scenting danger. But I have to report one disagreeable thing, and I talked this over with Lucas. This is that, coming to Harper Avenue the other night, I heard the child crying. She was inside Gersbach's car and couldn't get out, and the poor little thing was shaking and weeping. I thought she had shut herself in while playing, but it was after dark, and I didn't understand why she would be outside, alone, at bedtime. Herzog's heart had pounded with dangerous, thick beats at these words. I had to calm her, and then I found out that her mamma and Uncle Val were having a quarrel inside, and Uncle Val had taken her by the hand and led her out to the car, and told her to play for a while. He shut her up and went back in the house. I can see him mount the stairs while Junie screams in fright. I'll kill him for that. So help me, if I don't. He reread the concluding lines. Luke says you have a right to know such things. He was going to the phone, but I felt it would be upsetting and harmful to hear this over the phone. A letter gives one a chance to consider, think matters over, and reach a more balanced view. I don't think Madeline is a bad mother, actually.